Thanks for coming on the Gnostic Warriors, Stephan. How you doing today?
I'm doing right well, Mo. How are you?
I'm doing awesome. Thank you. I'm really excited about today's podcast. You're who I consider to be one of the godfathers of modern science in regards to consciousness. And to introduce you to the audience out there who might not know you, can you give them a little bit of your history and your background?
Oh. Oh, I don't know. I've been doing this a long time. I started doing experiments when I was in 1968, and I have been doing research on the nature of consciousness ever since then. With over 50 years now, I'm one of the people that created remote viewing. I use it particularly in application settings, most notably in archaeology. I've used it to find Cleopatra's Palace, Mark Antony's Palace, the Lighthouse of Pharos, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the Brig Leander, one of Christopher Columbus's caravels, a ship off the coast of Catalina Island. Lord, I don't know. I do research on therapeutic intention, healing, meditation, creativity, and more recently, I've begun looking at the relationship between consciousness, science, and religion. And I guess for the last 18 or 20 years, one of my principal focuses is on the nature of consciousness and how it affects social transformation. I wrote a book called The 8 Laws of Change about how you can become an agent of change, how individuals and small groups change history. I've written books. Oh, geez, I write novels. The first one was Awakening. The next one's Vision. The one that's about to come out, actually, on the 1st of May, is The Amish Girl. I do a workshop on glidewing called Opening to the Infinite, which is also the name of one of my books about how to train yourself to be able to open to the non-local aspect of consciousness. Oh, we've used it for criminological work, all sorts of things. I don't know. I've been at this, as I said, a long time.
Yeah, and that's an incredible background. So I think it's important that people know that history. Since 1968, you've been involved in this research and the science of it, and have actually used it in several applications, whether it be for private industry or for the government. And the remote viewing is very interesting to me. The consciousness aspect, the non-localized. What you just said. I read an interview, or excuse me, I listened to an interview recently of yours where you were talking about those agents of change and how a small group of people can change the world. And it's your belief that that's what has happened throughout time. And I believe you had said it's like a 10% have the ability to use their consciousness and their thoughts to affect change on the world and essentially change history. Can you talk a little bit about that, since you mentioned that?
Yeah, actually, let's 4 times in my life I've been involved in changing history, and I've paid close attention to how it happened. And that got me started doing research, looking at how it happened. And after a number of years of very intense research, I'm a data person, so I'm not a big person on theories and speculations. I'm focused on data, and so the opinions that I have are based on factual data, not on my theories about something. Or so anyway, as I was doing this research on social transformation, what I came to realize was that there were patterns that I had not previously seen. And the more I got into it, what I gradually came to see is that there were 8 laws that were the hallmarks of all successful social transformation movements. And they weren't at all what I would have thought. I mean, if you had asked me when I began this research, what does it take to make a social transformation movement work? I would have said, well, you either need to have an army, or you need to have a lot of money, or you need to control the media in some way. But it turns out none of those are true. I mean, that's sort of the popular myth, but the real 8 laws of change, and let's go through them because that's probably the best way to do it. So the 8 laws of change are first law is the individuals individually and the group collectively must share a common intention. And if you've ever been involved with any kind of committee on anything, whether it's your neighborhood or you're in Congress, you know it's hard to get people to get on board the same intention, to be on the same page. So the first thing you have to do in order to be successful is to get everybody to agree that they share a common intention. I learned this from the abolitionists and from the women's suffragettes. The law number 2 is the individuals and the group may have goals, but they may not have cherished outcomes. And this came out of really reading the correspondence and contemporaneous reports about abolition, in which people would say things like, slavery is a moral evil and we have to get rid of it. I don't know how we're going to do that, but it has to happen. And that's the difference between having a goal and a cherished outcome. A cherished outcome is, I want this to happen and I want it to happen in a certain way. To have a goal is to say, slavery needs to end, or women ought to be able to vote, or we ought to pay people equally, that kind of thing. So you can have a goal, but not a cherished outcome. If you have a cherished outcome, what happens is you cut off opportunities that might achieve your goal because they don't come, wrapped in the package that you expect. And you see this over and over again when you look at social transformation movements. Law number 3, the individuals in the group must accept that their goal may not be reached in their lifetime and be okay with this. And I got this also from the abolitionists and the women's suffragettes, that, they would say, for instance, with slavery, I don't know if it's going to end in my lifetime. It's so deeply entrenched in our culture, but it's just a moral wrong and it's got to end, and I'm going to work for it whether it happens in my lifetime or not. So law number 4 is the individuals in the group must accept that they may not get either credit or acknowledgement for what they have done and be okay with that. And I learned this mostly from the Quakers. The Quakers are a very interesting group of people. There are about 87,000 Quakers in the United States today. And in the whole course of American history, there have only been about 500,000, going all the way back to colonial times. It's such a tiny group of people that most Americans have never met a Quaker. I mean, there are 300 and whatever it is, 20 million Americans, and there's only 87,000 Quakers. It's like a small town. So most people have never met a Quaker, have no idea what they believe or what their practices are, or, who they are individually. I mean, the only thing people know about Quakers is that the Quaker Oats. And yet, if you look at all of the social transformations in the United States over the period of about 300 years, going back again to colonial times, abolition, public education, penal reform, women vote, public health care, the environmental program, the nuclear freeze, nonviolent resistance. If you look at all that and you track it back to its beginnings, as I did, what you discover is it begins with a little group of Quakers, and nobody knows their names. I mean, how many people know that Greenpeace, one of the largest environmental movements in the world, was begun by some Quakers and a few media guys up in Vancouver, Canada. Nobody.
No.
You think of it as this enormous organization with ships and magazines and all that stuff, and yet when you get back to the lick log, as we say in Virginia, where I'm from, what you find out is it's a little tiny group of Quakers. And so the Quakers taught me that they do this and they don't expect to get credit for it. They just do it because it's the morally right thing to do. So law number 5 is each person in the group, regardless of gender, religion, race, or culture, must enjoy fundamental equality, even as the various roles in the hierarchy of the effort are respected. This is because we're high order primates. You know, I said this once to a Christian group and they got really upset about this. But the truth is we're high order primates and all primates organize hierarchically. So that's the way humans organize. They organize hierarchically. But the key is, and that you see in the successful transformation movements, is that hierarchy is a function of particular processes, but that there is a fundamental equality that is shared by all the members of the group. That is, the men are not dominant over the women, the white people are not dominant over the black people, and so forth. The rich are not dominant over the poor, that there is just fundamental equality. They're human beings. And so successful social transformation movements all have this aspect. Law number 6 is the individuals in the group must forswear violence in word, act, or thought. Now, this for me personally was the hard one, because when I was involved with the civil rights movement and I went out on demonstrations and saw dogs being sicked on people, particularly young women, my immediate reaction was to figure out some way to strike back. But you have to give that up. I learned this from Gandhi. Gandhi is the only man who ever got a country independence without a war. And he did that because he came to understand what he said when he was interviewed just before he was assassinated. He just prior to being assassinated, a reporter came up to him and said, you know, I only have one question from my editor that we want to ask, and that is, how did you force the British to leave India? I mean, Britain was one of the most powerful countries on the earth, had a huge military. India was their most cherished crown jewel colonial possession. How did you force them to leave? You didn't have an army, you don't have any money, you didn't have an official position. And Gandhi's answer illustrates this point. He said, it isn't what we did that mattered, although that mattered. It isn't what we said that mattered, although it did matter. It was the nature of our character, who we were as people, that made the British choose to leave India. Notice the difference in the verb between force and choose. So nonviolence is a very significant part of social change. And the reason is that the difference between nonviolent and violent social change is that violent change is only successful about 25% of the time. 3/3 of the time, it's not successful. And even when it's successful, it doesn't last very long. National Socialism in Germany, the Nazis, for instance, they only last about 20 years. Communism in the Soviet Union really only lasts about 73 years. So it's within a single person's lifetime, whereas the United States, as an example, which was founded on a different kind of democratic change, wasn't nonviolent as Gandhi's was, but it attempted to create an inclusionist life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, we've been around now for going on 300 years, although we're in pretty desperate straits right now. So nonviolence, very important. Um, Law number 7, the individuals in the group and the group itself must make their private selves consistent with their public postures. And you can see this, boy, every day. You just look at the fundamentalist Christian. I just read a paper. Fundamentalist Christians are the largest user of porn in the United States.
Wow.
The hypocrisy of the Roman Catholic Church in its dealing with child sexual molestation, which has been going on now for over a decade and has been going on for probably millennia. I mean, there's a fundamental problem that's tearing the organization apart. I mean, Catholics are leaving the church because of this hypocrisy, because the private self and the public posture are not the same thing. And you can think of all kinds of supposed spiritual or religious leaders, you know, who are preaching one thing, but then, you know, in the back room, they're diddling little boys and girls or snorting coke. I mean, it's your private self and your public self have got to be exactly the same. Benjamin Franklin, I got this really from Benjamin Franklin for the first time. When Franklin was sent to France to be the minister plenipotentiary and basically to get from Louis the 16th the money to finance the American Revolution, because they didn't have the money. When he went over, I mean, he was an old man by colonial standards. He was an ancient man. So he gets, but he's also the most famous man in the world because he discovered electricity. So when he gets to France, he gets a letter from a woman friend of his, and she says, "Dr. Franklin, I have to warn you. I think your valet is a spy for the British," which in fact he was. But Franklin wrote back and said, "Thank you very much for telling me this, but if in all other respects my valet is good at his job, as in fact he is, I don't care, because I don't say anything in private that I would scruple to have be made public." And if you look at what's going on in the Trump administration right now, you see the exact opposite of that. So, you know, your private self and your public self have got to be the same. Otherwise, you're not authentic. And the 8th law is the individuals in the group and the group collectively must always act from the beingness of life-affirming integrity. And again, I got this from Gandhi. And if you want to see the power that a single individual can have, since we're speaking of Gandhi, think about Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau is sitting by his little pond in the end of the 19th century. And he's considered to be this kind of eccentric, he's a transcendentalist, but he's thought of even by his contemporaries as a bit of a kook. And he writes this book called Civil Disobedience, which is still in print, and I commend it to you. And he writes and publishes, it's so short, it's just really more of a monograph than a book. Anyway, when Gandhi is a young man and he is in South Africa, you know, he was a kind of Anglo-Indian. He became an English barrister, and he dressed like a barrister. He dressed in Western clothes and not at all the man that you see at the end of his life. Anyway, he was very proud of being a barrister and an Anglo-Indian. And he tried to buy a railroad ticket on the railroad in South Africa. And he wanted to buy a first-class ticket because he was very proud of the fact he had the money to do that. And they wouldn't sell it to him. They would only sell him a third-class ticket. And it really made him angry. So he made a big fuss, and it ended up with him being put in jail. And while he was in jail, I don't know, I could never been able to find out, he comes across Thoreau's little book. And he reads it, and it transforms his life. He says to himself, well, I'm going to go back to India and get independence for India, and I'm going to do it following the principles in this book. And he does. And Martin Luther King, who is a young Baptist, AME Baptist preacher in Birmingham, is offended by what he sees going on, the violence and civil rights. and decides to really start a civil rights movement that's going to change this. And he reads about Gandhi because of Gandhi's nonviolence. And he reads about Gandhi reading the civil disobedience, and he gets a copy and he reads it. And he models, like Gandhi, the civil rights movement on those principles. And so what you get is one eccentric guy that nobody paid any particular attention to when he was alive, sitting by his little pond, Walden Pond. And it is a pond, by the way, not a lake. I've actually been there. Sitting by his little pond, writes this book, and it changes the course of history in 3 countries: India, Great Britain, and the United States. That's power. And
Yes,
it's based on the idea of nonviolent beingness. That is the nature of your character, who you are as an authentic person. And those 8 laws, when you see those 8 laws in operation, and each successful social transformation movement, nonviolent social transformation movement that is successful, works it out. I mean, they just figure it out. But when you see those in operation, you see a group that's probably going to be successful. And if they don't put them in operation, for instance, if you look at the Occupy movement, I would say that it failed because it never put forward a personality like Martin Luther King or Gandhi. And so there was no person, because again, we're primates, there was no person for people to gather around, as you do in a religion, or, I mean, that's a whole other issue. But when you see these 8 laws in operation, you see a successful group. And we know from research that when 10% of any cohort, whether it's a school committee or a church group or a nation, when 10% of any cohort changes its consciousness about something fundamental, then the whole consciousness of the cohort, all of it, changes. And examples of this, for instance, are, look at the transition between gay and LGBTQ. I mean, if you go a Google word search and you go back and look, you'll see that about 3 years ago now, something like that, people began to stop using the word gay and use instead LGBT. Now, that's not just a change in terminology, that's also a change in thinking about gender. But it didn't happen because the president went on television and said, from now on, we're no longer going to say gay, we're going to say LGBT. And it didn't happen because the Congress passed a law. It didn't happen for any of those things you would think would be required. Instead, it was an individual personal decision that people made. Or another one is, when I was a boy and you went over to people's houses, you saw on their coffee tables in their living rooms an ashtray and a cigarette lighter and a pack of cigarettes. You never see that anymore. And it wasn't because somebody went on television and said, we're never going to do this anymore. It was because people looked at the research data and they said, no, they're not going to do that. And so only about 11% of the country smokes now. Anyway, if we're going to make these kind of changes, if your listeners, for instance, want to be involved in social transformation change that is life-affirming, here's how to do it. In fact, the people that are going to listen to your podcast, if they will do this, they can change the course of the 2020 election. How's that and it comes with a guarantee. So how's that?
That's awesome.
Every day you make hundreds of choices. It's the gas you buy, the toothpaste you buy, the soap you buy, the movies you choose to go to, the magazines you buy, all those things. Those are all choices. They're all votes. And so if you choose as a commitment that you first of all become aware you make all these choices, and second of all, that you consistently always choose the option available to you that is the most compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being as you understand it in that moment. And you do this every day. You make all your choices are compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being as the best choice of the options available to you. And you tell 10 people that you're doing this as a discipline and invite them to do it and join you. Well, you just do the math. I mean, if you started with 10 people, you'd go 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million. So, I mean, if you think about that and you have to get to 10%, then the people that are listening to this podcast have the power to, even though they don't know that, they don't have any army, they don't have any money, they don't have any military force, they don't have any official position maybe, but just on making choices, they can change the outcome of the election.
That sounds like a plan, and I think we could do it. You know, when I listen to those 8 laws, it really hits home. It's like I want to be involved in that group, but I also know that certain laws there, I have issues personally that I need to work on, you know, with how I was brought up. You know, each of us here in America, we've grown up in different families, different, you know, middle class, lower class. I grew up on the lower class side of it, lower middle class in a rough neighborhood in Orange County. You know, my first day of school, you know, to give you an example, I had a knife pulled on me in middle school. And that was kind of my upbringing. And it was a violent upbringing. And that became some of my fabric of who I am, meaning that I'm not violent now, but when someone confronts me, I always have that violent kind of like, hey, you know, I'm a black belt as well. I know how to control my anger to an extent, but when someone, you know, comes at me with violence, I'm going to end it with violence. That's kind of how I grew up and how I was taught. And if you didn't do that, you know, people were robbing you and taking everything from you. So I kind of took that hate and I bottled it up. And as I get older, I realize it's still part of who I am, and I'm working on it, but I'm also an entrepreneur, very busy. So it's very hard to work on that. But I see that it's possible. And I know meditation is one of the things that has helped me in the past. I'm doing it again. And I believe that that's the key. So I know you're an expert on consciousness. Can you talk a little bit about my issue with the violence, and then also with how meditation can help people like me out there? Because I know there's a lot of people that might be listening that are on edge or have similar backgrounds as well that you could help.
Yeah, well, you know, Mo, I can relate to that. As I said, of the 8 laws, the one that was hard for me was not to respond violently. And it's a discipline. I mean, to give you an idea, the way Gandhi got independence for India, really the turning point, the sort of hub around which it turned, was what's called the salt riot, the salt tax riot. In India at the time, it was illegal to make salt. Now, to make salt, if you're near an ocean, you go out and you get a dish and you fill it up with salt water and you just put it out in the sun and the water evaporates and you have salt. But that was illegal. And so poor people had to pay, there was a tax on salt. So Gandhi settled on that because it was a universal, I think. That's why he did it. And he organized a big march, just as Martin Luther King would later organize big marches in the civil rights movement. But before he organized the march, he had a training camp. And he trained his people. I talked to members of the Salt Riot group that were with him, and they told me he trained them just as hard as if they were soldiers. And so the day came, and they gathered after this long walk that they made down to where this salt riot was going to occur. And the British officers came out with their Indian troops that they commanded, and they were armed with like axe handles, staves, sort of like axe handles. And 11 people would walk forward in silence, and they would be clubbed to the ground by the Indian troops with the British officers standing behind them. And the women who had been trained as EMTs would run forward and get these people and pull them aside and treat the wounds that were created by the staves they were hit with. And another 11 would walk. And this went on all morning. And finally, as the day was getting on, the Indian troops began to look at each other and look at these people who were Indians, who were marching forward in silence and being clubbed to the ground. And they looked at each other, and then they just quit. And they turned to their British officers and said, "We're not doing this." And the British officers, they couldn't do it. And so Gandhi broke the tax.
Wow.
And he demonstrated to the Indian population, most of whom are peasants, that they had power, which they had never believed. And you saw the same thing in Birmingham, or you saw it with Orville Thalbus in Little Rock with the schools when the sheriff, I can't think of his name, Bonner or something, I can't think of his name right now, but when he had the dogs and they were trying to get the black kids to go into the schools, and these people went forward and they didn't resist. So I didn't say it was easy.
Sure.
I understand about this. I mean, I didn't grow up in the violence. I mean, that's not my background, but I get it. I've certainly been involved in enough demonstrations to understand about violence. And
what I found really interesting is when you shared that story with me, it really put it in perspective for me. You know, you shared something that is completely in a different country that has nothing to do with me. And that story immediately, when you told me, it like something in my heart, you know, and it almost brought tears to my eyes. In fact, it did a little to hear that and to hear those soldiers stop, you know, and it's these stories that change the world as well, you know, and it's these people that do that. So when you do that, that puts it in perspective for me.
Yes, and I want to say one final thing also about this, because I don't want to mislead people. You know, Gandhi was asked, well, what do you do if a lion attacks? And he said, well, you have to resist, of course. So this nonviolence, if you're accosted in an alleyway with a guy with a knife, you're not supposed to just lie down. That's not it. It's when it is a part of a mass movement that this kind of nonviolence is important. If you're accosted by a guy in the alleyway and you happen to be a black belt, well, you have a skill set that will allow you to defend yourself. So that's not the same thing. It's nonviolence for a principled purpose that I think that is the key to this. I mean, so, you know, in Gandhi's answer about the lion, when you're attacked by a lion, you defend yourself.
It's great. No, you put that perspective in there. You know, I got that myself. You know, we're taught that in martial arts. So, you know, going to my black belt and learning through the discipline system, it taught me to curb that anger. It wasn't easy at first, but it got easier as I got along. So it makes perfect sense. And you know, since this is a Gnostic podcast, and again, you're the modern godfather of consciousness, you talk about humanity being one aspect of life. So when you said that, it really intrigued me because, you know, in the ancient beliefs of, you know, Gnosticism and Hermeticism, they had a belief in the unseen world. And, you know, Paracelsus had called these elementals, and, you know, there were such terms as gnomes and salamanders and stuff like that. So when you said that we were, you know, one aspect of human life, it made me think of the elementals in that aspect and how we interact with this unseen world. You know, so I want you to talk about consciousness a little more in depth since we got through the 8 laws and a little bit of that theory. Let's talk about the multi-dimensional nature of consciousness, and if you could explain that your theory and the science behind it?
Well, I am a Planckian. Max Planck was the father of quantum mechanics. And in 1931, he was asked by a reporter from the Observer newspaper in England, who went to him and said, you know, you and Einstein are the two most famous scientists in the world. Well, two of the most famous scientists in human history. What have you learned? And I don't know what the reporter thought he was going to say or what he was going to answer. He was certainly not prepared for what he did say, because Planck's response was, what I've learned is that consciousness is causal and fundamental. You cannot get behind consciousness. Space-time, physical reality, arises from consciousness, not consciousness from space-time. That's a big deal. Consciousness is the fundamental, and we cannot get behind it. So, okay, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's my question. I'm a little lost there. Okay.
And then we can, I'll also include in that meditation, because they're related. So what he's trying to say is the same thing that you see in the yogic Vedas of Patanjali, or that you see in Empedocles, Greek pre-Socratic thinker, or in Socrates or Aristotle or Plato particularly, or in the shamanic traditions of Egypt or the Maya. I mean, you see it over and over again because people discover it through empirical observation, and that's why it shows up everywhere. It's not unique, and it's not something we're just learning in science today. What we are doing in science today is objectively being able to verify it, but that's a different issue. So what we're talking about is that consciousness is the causal fundamental. Now you think about that for a minute. That means that the idea that we're all locked in our own heads and that we have no contact with anything outside of ourselves except through our normal sense perception, taste, touch, smell, that sort of thing, sound. That instead you replace that idea, and that we're limited by time and space, dead meat, no consciousness. That is, the body dies, that's it, because consciousness arises from the physiological. So that's the sort of materialist modern view. It arises because of the Council of Trent. We can talk about that later, but just to stay on point. So what replaces that is a worldview in which you see that all consciousness is interlinked and interdependent, and that we live in a matrix of life, that all the beings on the planet have consciousness, and in fact, everything has consciousness, rocks, dirt, because it is a manifestation of intentioned consciousness. That was Planck's point. Space-time arises from consciousness, not consciousness from space-time. You think about that. Because if you look at the world that way, then you have to give up the Middle Bronze Age Abrahamic thinking, which dominates our culture. You know, all the three major Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are all trace their values back to the Middle Bronze Age. And in that view, we have dominion over the earth. Women are subordinate. We control. It's like we had a rich uncle who left us a bank account and we can exploit it any way we want. with no consequences. That's all that Abrahamic thinking. And it's all wrong, and we have to give it up because it doesn't work. I mean, that's why we're facing climate change. And instead, we need to replace it with a way of thinking of the world in which we live in a matrix of life, in which humanity is one form of the consciousness that is in this matrix, and that we don't have dominion over it. We can manipulate it, but we do so without recognizing the inherent interconnected, interdependent nature of consciousness at our peril. That's what's created climate change. Climate change is the result of a consciousness which says we can exploit the Earth's resources and we don't have any consequences. So it's perfectly okay. Extractive petroleum and carbon energy is just fine. When in fact, we can see now that what it's doing is literally threatening the existence of civilization. Because when you disrupt these great meta-systems of the Earth, things go awry in ways which threaten the extinction, not only of now researchers are talking about 60% of the species on the planet going extinct, but humanity possibly as well. I mean, I think it's not an exaggeration to say climate change is a civilization-threatening event, unlike anything that we have ever faced in human history. And if we don't prepare for it, we are not necessarily going to survive. We need to begin to think of this matrix of consciousness so that we make choices that support its well-being. We need to develop the idea that the function of the state is not to produce profit, but to produce well-being. You know, as I say, I'm a data person. I care. All I care about is data. I'm not particularly interested in people's partisan views and their political theories, and that's not what interests me. What interests me is data. And if you look at the data, you can see right now that in almost every social outcome measurement you can take, whether it's infant mortality, maternal mortality, obesity, incarceration, literacy, racial equality, gender equality, education, chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes. At every one of those, the United States ranks very low. We're 37th in the world in terms of health care. We lead the world in infant mortality and maternal mortality. We have the highest. If a child born in rural America has less of a chance to get to its first birthday than a child born in Botswana, Africa. I mean, when you look at these actual statistics, the social outcome data that's available, I mean, you can find it. I publish it every day in the Schwartz report, the newsletter I give away, or the news blog. When you look at the data, you see that the choices that we are making, which are based entirely on profit, the American culture has only one social priority, and that's profit. And that's not what the founders had in mind. They had in mind life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if you look at this and you compare, I mean, just to give you one example, you look at Norway and the United States in terms of healthcare. And I picked Norway because Norway doesn't have the best healthcare. It has the 11th best healthcare. And it spends 7.6% of its gross domestic product, its GDP, on maintaining healthcare to get to the 11th. Not the best, 11th. We have the 37th best healthcare. We're down there with developing countries. In fact, there are some developing countries have better healthcare than we do. And we spend about 18% of our GDP on healthcare, multiples more than any other country on earth. to produce these very, very shoddy outcomes. So if we could do just as well as Norway, for instance, as I said, which is the 11th, and we could spend, as Norway does, 7.6% of GDP as opposed to 18% of GDP, we would free up about a $1.5 trillion. And that would be enough money to send everybody to college and give prenatal care and elder care and all those other things that we can't seem to afford, because it's a complete lie that we can't afford these things. We spend more than anybody else on earth to get these incredibly shoddy outcomes, because we're not spending it to produce well-being, we're spending it to produce profit. And if you, the theorem of well-being, which I developed out of all this research, is that social policies which support and foster well-being are always, I can't find an exception. If you can find one, you tell me about it. I hear these politicians, oh, we can't afford that. We couldn't afford health care for all. The only reason we can't afford health care for all is because the system that we've got is only about profit. But as I said, if you could just do what Norway does, we could easily afford it. So the theorem of well-being says that social policies that foster well-being are always cheaper, more effective, more efficient, more productive, easier to implement, more pleasant to live under, longer enduring, and did I say much, much cheaper? So the question is, what are we doing? Why don't we have a society that is based on creating well-being? Well-being for the individual, the family, the community, the state, the nation, the planet itself. In order to meet the challenges that we are facing and that we're going to face big time in the next 20 years, so many of your viewers are going to, or your listeners are going to be around. If we don't make these changes, we don't change our technologies. The Abrahamic technologies are exploitive, designed for profit, and have no long-term strategy. Well-being oriented policies are cheaper, have foster well-being, and have long-term strategies. So you can see it in the rise of solar and wind. Most of Europe is on record as saying, as a matter of policy, they're going to eliminate carbon-powered vehicles from their roadways by 2040. The Chinese are on this in 100 ways. They already dominate solar. They're dominating wind. They see that this is going to create millions of jobs. It's going to create enormous new industries.
And let me ask you this.
Well-being.
Yeah, Stephan, I see exactly what you're saying, and I want to let you know that I'm trying to do my part in my family as well. We understand these social issues and these cultural issues that we're facing. We're eating organic. We're trying to consume less and spend less, and we're trying to do our part as a family. I see the change, though. I see it slowly happening, not as fast as we need it to happen. So that's what I wanted to ask you in regards to that 10%. I see, 3 to 5% of my friends and family kind of starting to make those changes where 5 years ago, no one ate organic. Now it's one of the hottest things, and everybody's into well-being, and everybody's a coach now and teaching you how to do it. So it's like I'm seeing exactly what you're saying we need happen on the street here and happen in social media, but we also have a long way to go. What do you think needs to happen with this change in consciousness to get us there? Do you think it's not enough where we're at now?
Oh, it's nowhere near enough. Yeah, I do trend analysis, and so like you, I see good trends. I do interviews with people like you because of what you're doing. I don't do interviews with people who are proposing other ways, violence or racism or, whatever.
Sure.
So yes, you are an example. What you're saying is you are an example of what needs to happen. It happens at the local, personal level, and then it goes up. You know, one of the areas in which I was involved with changing history, I said 4 times in my life I've been involved with changing history. And one of the ones was the transformation of the American military from an elitist conscription organization, the military I served in during the Vietnam era, to an all-volunteer meritocracy. And when we started doing that, that began under a man named Elmo Zumwalt, who was the chief of naval operations at the direction of Mel Laird, who was Secretary of Defense. Anyway, when we began this, the original conception that they had when I came aboard was they would do it from the top down. That is, they would issue edicts and orders and things like that, and that's how it would be achieved. But I and others, not just me, but I and others said, you know, the key to this is to retain people. I mean, the reason the military was transformed was not out of altruistic good feeling. The problem was that a modern military can't operate on a conscription basis. Because if you conscript a guy for 3 years, as was, you know, when back in the Vietnam era, or 2 years, for instance, to train a sonar man on a ship in the Navy costs about $500,000. And it takes about 18 months to learn how to do it. So if you've got a guy for 3 years and it takes 18 months just to get him up to speed, and then he leaves and you have to start all over again, well, that's just not supportable. It worked when all you needed to do was know how to pull a rope or pull up an anchor or that sort of thing. But when you're talking about people who are using high technology to run missiles or radars or that kind of thing, I mean, it takes a long time to learn how to do. And so the problem the military faced during the Vietnam era was that people didn't stay. And so we spent all these billions of dollars training these guys, and then they would leave. So the difficulty, the challenge was, how do you get them to stay? And the original idea was they were going to do it from the top down, which would never have worked. And a group of us said, no, we got to do this from the bottom up. We need to find out what would cause people to stay. And a lot of senior officers all said, oh, well, that'll compromise command and control, and they'll want to do all kinds of crazy things and not military things, all that sort of stuff. And no, we can't do it that way. But eventually we did do it that way. And we put up what we call rap sessions. That shows you how dated it is now. This is back in the early 70s. And when we got these young officers and young enlisted guys together in these rap sessions and said to them, you know, what would it take to get you to stay? The answer was not, oh, we need to reduce the command structure, which is what they were fearful of, the senior officers. No, it was things like, we need more daycare centers. We need more laundromats in the apartment buildings where the junior enlisted families were, because the wives, they didn't have enough laundry machines to launder the diapers or all the clothes the children wore, or if they had to work too because you didn't get paid very much as a young enlisted guy, they needed daycare centers. And so it was that kind of stuff. They liked being in a hierarchical organization. They didn't want to reduce the command structure at all. In fact, in some cases, they wanted to strengthen it. Another thing we found out was we were convinced, the senior officers were convinced, they were completely freaked out about marijuana. I mean, it's laughable now when I think about it, but absolutely just completely freaked out about marijuana. And so they built a bunch of hospitals because they thought they had this huge drug problem. And when we got down to the lick log and we said, okay, if you have a drug problem and you come into a facility, we won't hold it against you in your 201 file, your personnel file, and it won't affect your promotion opportunities. As soon as that was said, what we discovered was we had a huge alcohol problem, and it wasn't with the junior enlisted and the junior officers. It was with the senior NCOs and the senior officers. They were drunks. And so all these drug facilities got turned into alcohol facilities because the real problem the military had was alcoholism. I mean, yes, there were a lot of people that used marijuana, but actually, when they came back from Vietnam, they often didn't continue. And in fact, even the people who use heroin. And now we know from research that when you put people in highly stressed situations, poverty is an example, as I'm sure you experienced this, given what you told me about your own background. When you put people in highly stressed situations, they use drugs and alcohol. When they're not in highly stressed situations, they don't. They learned this from animal testing. They took rats and they gave them drugs like cocaine. And when they were highly stressed, the rats, they used drugs. But when they put them in cages and in environments where there was low stress and where they could do what they wanted to do, what they needed to do, they didn't use them. And if you look at the data on people who take painkillers because they have really difficult pain, when the pain stops, they stop using it. The only people that continue are the recreational users. And you mentioned meditation earlier. And so one of the things I want to say about meditation is that it is probably the most important gift you can give yourself. I've been a daily meditator for 50 years. And the research about meditation is absolutely clear and unimpeachable, and there are thousands of papers. Daily meditators increase their IQ, they increase their concentration, they improve their memory, their sleep improves, their dream life improves, their weight improves, their immune system improves, their sex life improves. I mean, just everything you can think of. I designed a meditation technique called Meditation for Modern Minds, and you can go to my website, www.stephanashwartz.com, and get this. I've got a CD. I give away written instructions. There is a way to reprogram yourself without constantly fighting. Most of our psychiatric issues arise because we are in conflict with ourselves about something. And the way you deal with this is not in the conflict, but in meditation, where you can reprogram yourself. There's a reason why martial art dojos, Buddhist temples, and Christian monasteries all teach meditation. And the key to meditation is that the function of it, however you do it, and there are many, many ways to do it. There's no one way to do it. But the way that you do it, when you do it every day, 20 minutes a day, every day, is that not only can you reprogram yourself, but you learn how to attain and sustain intentioned, focused awareness. And that's the key to opening to non-local consciousness. You have this aspect of yourself which is timeless. It's outside of space and time. It's what religion calls the soul. And you can get in touch with it through meditation. And you do that because most of our time is spent being overwhelmed by the sense impressions that flow into our neuroanatomy. Things smell, the sounds we hear, whatever, all the stuff that just comes in, plus all of the chatter that's going on in our minds. All of that cloaks this, what in religion they call the still small voice, which is this non-local aspect of consciousness.
And let's
Work
talk
with
about,
meditation, you learn how to open yourself to that. And when you learn how to open yourself to that, then everything changes.
Stephan, let's talk about that little self. It's interesting when you say in meditation, you basically block out all those other senses and those distractions and everything that's hitting us all day. It really made me think about what you were saying right now, because again, I'd mentioned I'm a business owner. I'm constantly overloaded with different things all day, texts coming in, problems, employees, issues 24/7. And the hardest thing is to kind of shut the outside world out. And sometimes it's the point, like, the only break I get is when I actually do a podcast like this, because I'm in my office right now. No one could bug me. My phone's out there. And it's one of the hardest things to do, but I know I need to do it because it's affecting my health. It's affecting my sleep right now. And you're talking to someone that used to meditate. And I remember one of the things that happened when I learned to meditate, I read this book. I forget what it was about, right brain meditations or something. But anyways, I remember just this surge of creativity and happiness. And like, I just was in connection with myself. So when you talked about the little self and the soul, it really put those two things together. This world and these distractions distract from our true selves. And I wanted to talk about our true selves because, again, this is a Gnostic podcast, and knowing thyself was one of the main axioms of the Gnostics, and nothing in excess. They kept things real simple, but knowing thyself seems to be one of the hardest things. And you mentioned, in the 8 laws, being authentic to yourself and being authentic. That's one of my things too. Is I grew up, like I had mentioned, on the street, and then I was a punk rocker, and my thing was everybody else was fake and I was real. And hey, what you see is what you get with me. And I kind of live by that principle still. But I wanted to talk about consciousness and the self. What is the relationship to knowing thyself, the Gnostic axiom, and consciousness, in your opinion?
Well, no, the Gnostics were a group who began. No, let me go back. Let me start it differently.
Sure.
All religions are empirical sciences. If you think about it, every religion, all the enduring ones, I make that point, enduring as opposed to cults. All the enduring religions begin because a single individual has a non-local consciousness experience. Jesus gets baptized by John, and he goes into the desert and he meditates and he has this awakening. Buddha goes to a meditation teacher who teaches him how to meditate, and he awakens. Muhammad goes into the cave Hira, a sacred cave, and he has an experience. The angel Gabriel, he says, appears to him, and he awakens. So all these religions, I mean, I could give you many others, but
Sure.
The 3 big Abrahamics. Buddhism's not an Abrahamic, but the 3 really big religions:
Yeah.
Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism.
Yeah, Moses with the burning bush, yes. Yeah.
Hinduism, I guess we include that too, because it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, it doesn't begin, you can't trace that back. It goes back so far, you can't trace it back to a single person. Anyway, religions begin with a single person having a non-local consciousness experience. And if that person is charismatic enough, when he talks or she talks about it, people listen. If what they say is resonant to the gestalt of the culture in which they are speaking, that is, if people can hear them, then people gather around them and the beginnings of a religion start. Religion it begins with an individual experience, but it is a collective intention. It's a shared common intention. And if you think about it, all religions, when you strip away the dogmas, because what happens is whoever has the original experience talks about it, people write that down or record it in some way, and then they begin to try and interpret it, and that's how you get scripture and dogma. And all of that is just man-made. You strip the dogma and all that away, and you just get down to the fundamentals. You start with this individual who has a non-local consciousness experience, and then they talk about it, and other people listen, and they begin to gather at a fixed place. And so you pick a place that you go to, whether it's a temple or a shrine or a synagogue or a church or a cathedral. It doesn't make any difference. Or an Etruscan oak grove, doesn't matter. Why do they gather at that place? We know now from the experimental research that when a lot of people focus on a specific location of a particular place, that it changes the information structure at the non-local level of which that physical place is a manifestation, and it becomes highly numinous. That's why, for instance, in remote viewing, it's easier to see Chartres Cathedral than it is a warehouse. And so there you gather at a fixed time, and you begin with a statement of common intention. If you're a Christian, it would be the Nicene Creed. If you're a Jew, it would be the Shema. If you're a Buddhist, it would be a sutra. So you make a statement of common intention. Why? We know from the neuroscience that because when you do that, there is brain entraining, and all of the neuroanatomies of all the people present at the site become entrained. They get linked. Then there is a period of singing, dancing, chanting, drumming, whatever. Why? Because again, from neuroscience, we know that when that happens, that it causes this brain entraining and the holding of common intention. And then there comes a period when some, but not all of the individuals of the organization or the cohort that's gathered have the potential to have a public non-local consciousness experience. Doesn't always happen, but can happen. The potential's there. Speaking in tongues, healing, possession by one of the voodoo deities, whatever. So if you think about it, what religions really are is empirical sciences. Empirical in the sense that they arise because of observation over long periods of time. And if you look across the whole course of human history, what you find is that these same principles of the gathering place, the drumming, the singing, all of that, all those things I outlined, that they appear over and over and over again, regardless of culture, regardless of geography, regardless of time. The Gnostics are one example of this, but there are many, many. The Sufis are another. And what makes the Gnostics attractive is that they made consciousness an explicit part of what they were doing. But in a sense, all religions are about non-local consciousness. And if you think about it, they're about training you to have a non-local consciousness experience. You pray or you meditate. One is sort of holding an intention to create change, what in research we would call non-local perturbation, or to obtain information, what in research we would call non-local perception. So those two processes and the way to achieve it occur again and again and again and again and again all across human history, because there is an innate recognition that we are more than animated meat, and that there is an aspect of us that exists before we incarnated and that will continue after our physical death. And that idea that you are more than just a physical being, and that there is a fundamental nature of consciousness, however it gets expressed and whatever dogmas are attached to it. When you get to the lick log, the core of it, it's all the same stuff. You are not a physical being only. You are a being that has an aspect of consciousness that is your fundamental nature, and that you can make contact with it through meditation and through prayer, through listening and through holding an intention. And in doing that process, you awaken to this part of yourself because you allow the chatter of the mind and the sense impressions to retreat into the background. And when you do this, as I said, the consequences for you personally, 20 minutes a day, that's it. Now, the consequences are that you completely reprogram yourself. You become a different person. The difficulty, you'd think it'd be easy to do, but it's actually, people have a hard time developing the practice of meditation because the robots of the mind resist it. Because what happens when you take on meditation as a discipline is that the robots get forced into a subordinate position. And so all of your lusts and all your desires and all your resentments and all of your hates, all of your loves, all of that stuff that's driving you most of the time, all of that retreats into the background. And what happens instead is that you open like the lotus. In fact, that's why the lotus is a symbol in Asian religions. You open like the lotus into a new dimension. And then all kinds of interesting things happen. So when I say that the greatest gift you can give to yourself is to develop the daily practice of meditation for 20 minutes, I mean that quite literally.
Yeah, I imagine the book that you had written, or the meditation, the 20-minute meditation, you mentioned it's meditation for the modern man. I'm assuming that's meditation for the modern Western man in our busy world. So I'm assuming I need that. I'm having a tough time right now, probably the toughest time I've had trying to meditate because of my business and that monkey chatter and then everything that I have going on in my life. But I know it is the answer, because when I do it, I see a tremendous amount of value and change, but I need to make it more of a habit. And like you had said, it's one of the hardest things to make a habit, especially in this world, but we need to make that time. You know, you mentioned all those health benefits that you can garnish from simply meditating 20 minutes a day. So it's something I need to do. I'm 47 and I'm getting older and I'm starting to feel my age. And, you know, I want to control my mind and my thoughts. That's about being a Gnostic, is being in control. And a modern Gnostic, you're in control of your body, you're in control of what you put in your mouth, you're in control of what you think. And sometimes I can't do that, you know, and I want to be honest with you. And so I fight with that. You know, I wanted to ask you, while I still have you here, Stephan, is that Plato had said, all learning is remembering. And one of the things when you become a Gnostic, in my interpretation, you become what they call today woke, or you become illuminated. And to me, that's essentially waking up to who you are and kind of out of the materialistic realm that I believe our world is built upon. And we're going that way. And you're just kind of caught up in the, you know, the Disneyland world, and you really don't know anything about philosophy or consciousness. You know, all that stuff was really foreign to me. But once I started learning about it, you know, I became so-called woke. And one of the things that I had learned is I started learning about philosophy and Gnosticism. And, you know, I got drawn to Freemasonry because there's certain teachings in there, and I really resonated with it. And one of the things that I learned was that all learning is remembering. And I'm a real big believer that if we continue along the path possibly of our ancestors, and I have a theory here I want to share with you, is that our DNA is part of that consciousness. And when we plug in back to this life, we can remember some of these teachings, we can carry on some of these sciences, like I feel we're doing here in the United States of America, that now we don't have the threat of being, the Inquisition or being persecuted. Guys like yourself, since 1968, have the freedom to pursue consciousness. You're really a modern Gnostic in the sense that you're continuing these sciences without the Abrahamic religions over you telling you what to do. So I feel like we are in this Gnostic kingdom recreating these sciences that we always knew, but we're bringing the analytical and all the data to it. So what do you feel in regards to consciousness being related to DNA and memories tying in there to one of the greatest philosophers, Plato, saying all learning is remembering?
Well, we know from the research that that meditation, among other things, changes your DNA. It changes the little caps on the telomeres. So this issue of memory, I think what they're trying to say actually is, again, you go back, consciousness is causal and fundamental. Space-time arises from consciousness. Well, what does that mean? Well, what it means, I think, I've been doing this research, as I say, for 50 years, over 50 years, is that what we're dealing with is an information phenomena. That what happens is you organize information, that's the remembering. Now, the big mystery question is, what is information? And I don't have an answer for that, and nobody that I know has an answer either. I ask people all the time. But in any case, we don't know what information is, but we do know things about how to manipulate it. Meditation is one of them. By holding meditation, and by the meditation technique that I developed uses what I call words of power, where you take a word and you use that word, and after a while, the word represents both where you are at the moment and where you aspire to be. Let's say you were overweight and you wanted to be thinner, and so your word might be food, as an example. Again, I've written this up. It's on my website. You can download the instructions of how to do this. You can also go to academia.edu and download my papers on meditation, the psychophysical process that works. You can go, let's see, my website, my books. You can go to Amazon, search on my name. Both my novels and my nonfiction books all get into this, because this is, I think, is so important. I write it up over and over again. But what happens is you change the information structure. That's the remembering part. What they mean is that when you open yourself to the non-local, you can cause changes in the information structure. The very act of intentioned observation does that. That's why Chartres Cathedral is easier to see in a remote viewing than a warehouse. Why? Because people have been focusing on Chartres Cathedral for hundreds of years, whereas nobody pays any attention to a warehouse. So all those individual acts of intentioned observation make a difference.
Stephan, and you're talking about the cathedral, and it really made me think about the secrets, the hidden secrets. The Freemasons talk about encoding the secrets in stone, and these cathedrals have these geometrical patterns, and you see this through a lot of the Gothic cathedrals that were rebuilt through the Middle Ages and so forth. And we recently had, of course, Notre Dame had the recent fire. It's going to be restored and rebuilt. But these structures that you talk about, like the cathedral, have these geometrical patterns. And I know you talk about intent, the people and the spiritual aspect of it as well. Do you believe that the patterns, the geometrical patterns that, the Freemasons along with the clergy had encoded into these structures play a part with that remote viewing at all? Have you found that in any of your data or your science?
Well, gematria is what you're talking about.
Sure.
I've never done a gematria study. They did at Princeton, they did a study about that involved gematria, and they found that the shapes did make a difference. You know, back in the 70s and 80s, I guess I have it right. There was the whole pyramid thing, and people were meditating under pyramids, but I think that was grossly misrepresented. But in any case, going into certain shapes, does that make a difference? And the answer would be, I think, yes, it would make a difference. There's a reason why those cathedrals are developed the way they are. By the way, I don't know if you know it. It's very few people seem to know it, but the United States Capitol has Masonic geometric symbols carved in places all through the building, because the founders, many of whom were Masons, believed that, and so they saw it was when they built the Capitol. Well, and after the founders, when they started building the Capitol, they built because of the role of Freemasonry in the founding of the country. They factored that in, and so there are these little symbols that are carved all over the building for precisely that reason. I think that the basic answer I would give would be anything which causes the focusing of intentioned focus awareness, and which augments your ability to attain intentioned focused awareness, is a plus. At the same time, I mean, you could also be very successful meditating anywhere, but it's like it helps. It's like you know, the little cat's eyes you see on the road when you're driving. You could drive that road without the cat's eyes, but in a rainstorm, the conflict of daily life, those little cat's eyes, which you hardly notice otherwise, make a big difference. And so I think that's what's behind gematria. You see it again, it's an empirical science. You know, acupuncture is an empirical science.
Sure.
Ayurvedic medicine is an empirical science. Biodynamic gardening is an empirical science. These are things which developed because people observed that when you did this, you got a result. And so throughout human history, the shapes of buildings have been designed to, particularly buildings which are involved with consciousness, which all churches, temples, shrines are, that those buildings are designed in part when, depending on the community that builds them and their awareness of this, but the great ones that move us were all designed with this sort of empirical science of gematria built into them.
Sure. And in regards to the consciousness, I know we're limited on time here, so I've got a couple more important questions for you here. Is the consciousness, I'm finding that there's possibly two forms of consciousness, and correct me if I'm wrong. And where I'm going with this is the ancient Gnostics had believed that there was two spirits. And this is kind of where I'm going with more of a modern twist to it, is they believed that there was a spirit from God, a good spirit, and then they believed that there was a counterfeit spirit, which would be the bad spirit. And where I'm going with this is, and when I look at modern times and researching people and crimes in particular, and I have this interest in demonology, meaning people that claim they are taken over by demons and so forth. So what I'm finding I went to jail before, I've been to prison because I had a rough upbringing, is a lot of the people that were there weren't conscious of their crimes, or they did their crimes when they were drunk or under drugs or a certain thing what they would have never done if they were fully awake and conscious. And I could relate to that because I've done things, whether under drugs or alcohol, that I would never do when I'm sober and I'm my real self. So the question I'm asking here is what is the research out there, if you've come across, if you have any knowledge about this in regards to people becoming unconscious through drugs or through drinking, and they become violent, or they become demonic, or they become evil, and they do things, killing people, whatever, that they never would have done if they were truly conscious, maybe of the good spirit. So my theory here is that possibly these people, they're losing their consciousness, and then these vehicles, these meat vehicles that you're talking about, are possibly taking over by another consciousness. And I want to relate that to the Abrahamic side of the coin, which you're going to be going into with a future book, and maybe this will give you some food for thought, is that the earth has a specific consciousness that's related to fungi. And this fungi is a parasite, and that's what I believe is the counterfeit spirit. Okay, and I know I'm going into kind of a weird realm here, but and I'm being long-winded, but I believe this fungi, this parasite, is the counterfeit spirit. And in any event, let's not go there. Okay, so let me throw that out there, and then what do you believe happens to these people that lose their consciousness and then they do these horrible acts?
Okay, let's do that.
Okay.
When the Gnostics talk about the two spirits, what they're talking about is the eternal self, this non-local aspect of consciousness, and the aspect of consciousness that is driven by sensory impressions and
the body, right?
the body, yeah.
Sure. Okay.
The cravings or whatever.
And they were highly dualistic. So let me add there, they believed the spirit was separate from, of course, this meat sack or the physical body. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I don't agree with that. I don't think that's supported by the evidence at all, but I understand how they got to it. I'm familiar with it. I just don't agree with it. Again, because it's an empirical science and they didn't have a way to objectively validate these things, so they couldn't fine tune them as we can do it today.
Sure.
I would say rather, let's take prisoners. I have some experience with that, not as being one, but of working with prisoners.
Okay.
If we taught everybody in the country meditation, or mindfulness as they like to call it now, because meditation seems to have religious overtones for a lot of people. It's not really. It has, religions do it because religions are all fundamentally about non-local consciousness, even though they don't know it themselves and have gotten lost in the interpretations and dogmas and all that. But if we taught everybody meditation, it's beginning in childhood, we would have an enormous decrease in criminality, because it would give people a grounding and an awareness of their true nature that you simply don't have if you grow up in an impoverished circumstance that's violent and all the rest of it. I mean, the United States has 4.4% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. We have a new American slavery. I've just written a paper about this that's going to be published. I'll send it to you when we get through. But it's horrifying, absolutely horrifying. We run the largest gulag in the world, and millions of men, women, and children have their lives destroyed by the American gulag and the new American slavery. That's a whole subject. We can do a whole show on that. But relative to what you're speaking of, the reason people do violent things and what you think of as demons, what those are information constructs. Again, it's an information phenomena. So when people routinely hold negative responses they're feeding into the information structures that we come to call demons. That's just a religious word. We know, for instance, that therapeutic intention research, that is healing research, that it can both heal and hurt. There are a great number of studies which show that you can hold negative intention as well as healing intention, and that you can have an effect on the physical well-being of another organism, whether it's a fungal or a bacteria or a small animal or a bird or a fish or a human being. And you align yourself with these information structures based on your personal cravings and desires. And when you are stressed by poverty and racism, and I mean, the overwhelming number of black and brown people in the American gulag is just, I mean, it's obscene. Really, and it's almost a taboo subject. You can't hardly talk about it. I'm absolutely just beside myself. I just finished this paper that I wrote about the American gulag. It's the moral cancer that's eating America alive. It's just awful. Anyway, if we taught kids to meditate beginning in school, we would have much less crime. Now, am I saying that as a speculation? Am I saying that as a theory? Or am I saying that as a fact? And I am saying it as a fact. So let me give you some facts. In San Francisco, the 4 worst schools in the San Francisco public school system got so bad that somebody had the good sense to decide to teach these kids to meditate. And so they had a little period every day, about 20 minutes, where they would gather, all the students in their classrooms would sit and meditate in a simple little mindfulness program. Nothing religious about it. Now, these were kids who grew up in neighborhoods that were so bad that almost every one of these children, when surveyed, had either seen somebody shot or been shot or had a family member shot. So violence was their daily experience. They had huge alcohol and drug problems in this community because people who felt they had no future, I mean, why not get stoned? So all of the terrible things that you think about, all of those things routinely happened to these kids. The girls were raped routinely. The boys were beat up. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. When you look at the research data, it was just horrible. So they started teaching them, they taught them this mindfulness technique. They did it 20 minutes a day. What did they see? Violence amongst these students dropped enormously by several orders of magnitude. Much less violence in the schools, much less violence against the teachers. In the families that had students that were taking part in this program, there was an increase in nonviolent interaction in the family. So the families were affected. And after they'd been doing this for a while, somebody came along and said, oh, that's a waste of money. We ought to cut that program out. And when they tried to do it, the students rebelled and said, no, you gotta, we want to do this. So when you go to prisons, for instance, I went to a prison in Los Angeles, and I got to talking with, I was doing some work with this group of prisoners. And one was this very bright black kid who was about 19 years old. And I said to him finally at one point, how in the world did somebody as smart as you end up here? And his answer, really, I have never forgotten. This was a number of years ago. He said, well, I wanted to go to college, but I didn't have any money and my family didn't have any money. And then my mother got sick and I had to get money. And so drug dealing was, I could make money. I couldn't get a job. Nobody'd hire me. They didn't have any money to send me to school. There was no way I could get a scholarship. He said, but it's really weird. They got $26,000 a year to keep me in prison. And the fact is that we spend between $33,000 and $60,000 a year per person to keep men and women in prison. You could send your kids to Yale for the money that it costs to keep a medium security felon in prison. Now, how could that possibly be that we have billions of dollars to warehouse human beings, but we can't educate them? And the largest debt in the country, other than mortgage debt, bigger than credit card debt, is student debt. All of this arises because of this information structure idea, and that when you structure your society solely to make profit, that's the information you're using, you have horrible outcomes. Whereas if you look at other countries who have much, much smaller percentages of people that are incarcerated and a much, much lower level of recidivism, because when they are in prison, what they're trying to do is to help them deal with their demons, their drug issues, all that, so that when they get out, they encourage them and the society helps them to get jobs. And it's like dealing with homeless people. Again, in San Francisco, they have a huge homeless problem. They built some tiny houses to house these homeless people. And when they did, they discovered that the actual cost to the city to take care of the homeless people, when you put them in the tiny houses, was a fraction of what it cost to let them be on the street. Because when they were on the street, they went into the emergency rooms, they had no money, so they had to pay for their medical expenses, they had to pay for cleaning crews to clean up the feces on the street in San Francisco, and on and on and on. And when you realize that the lawyers, the cops, the social workers, the judges, the prison guards, all of these people, it's like the opioid crisis. In the opioid crisis, it was a completely created legal drug addiction system. And it made billions of dollars for the pharmacists and the doctors and the Sackler family and everybody else who was involved with this. We had no money to deal with the conditions that produced the drug addiction, but we sure had plenty of money to spend on making them addicted and profiting from their addiction. So this is all about, you have to change the structure of society so that it fosters well-being, and that you take the people that are in the American gulag and you treat them not as little valves so that you can tap into the tax monies. Again, think about this. We are privatizing our prisons. They are actually advertising the workers who get paid anywhere from $12 to $1.23 an hour. All of that results from basically what you would think of as the evil consciousness.
Sure. Okay.
This is the lower consciousness that exploits people, that sees them as independent of you, that you have no relationship to them. They're just an exploitable source of money. And in fact, what you're really doing is crippling society.
So let me ask you this, Stephan. If people were conscious to this reality, everything we're talking about now, the so-called woke people, and then those people that aren't woke, the 99%, like I like to call them, if say 9% of those people were woke and they could start feeding the information, their thought patterns around them, right? Their thought patterns, the good patterns, good food, making changes with themselves, making changes with their children, And then we have that effect from that 10%, and it just expands and expands from there. We could change it. So what you're saying, this consciousness we have as a national consciousness, this mental illness that we're all suffering from, is a national mental illness. And in order to change it, we need to change it at the root level at Washington. So that's why I gather that after all these years of research, 50 years of research, you're now heading for Washington and the religions as well to get on board with your program here, right?
No, not exactly, Mo.
Okay.
What I think needs to happen is it needs to change at the individual level. And when you get 10%, we have, I don't know, 320 million people, about 318 million people. I haven't looked recently. Let's say 318. So that means when you get 31.8 million people who wake up to this, that society will change. And what will happen? Well, look at the Nordic countries. You know, I mean, we have societies, national societies, who have taken a very different course. They make well-being the function of the national system, well-being at every level. And when you look at those cultures and you look at their outcome data, what you see is low incarceration, low obesity. I mean, just the obesity issue. I was in Europe recently and in China. And I was in China for 3 weeks and I did not see a single fat person. And that's a very interesting observation. I came back and on the line going, I transferred, I had to fly to Europe and then transfer. And when I transferred and I got into the United States and I went to pick up my luggage, I looked around me and about 30 to 40% of the people were overweight. And now this is a result of personal choices, but it's also the result of food industries and what they're doing. And again, it's all gets down to profit. So if we had a food system and a pharmaceutical system, and the way that's going to change is not Washington is not going to do it. It's got to be done at the individual level, because when people collectively hold a common intention, it's the 8 laws again. When they hold a common intention, I'm hoping that that climate change is going to become one of the central issues of the 2020 election, because if we can get 31.8 million people, or whatever the exact number is, if we can get 10% of America to make that shift, we can change. You know, the American Revolution, only about 13% of the population of the colonial period were actually involved with the war. And when it started, only about 3% were in support of it. So you don't have to get everybody. We don't have to get everyone. We have to get 10% to make different choices, so that you make just not only with the things you buy, but the way you treat people. You know, there's a reason why most religions talk about tithing or volunteer work or something like that, donating, because when you donate to the collective intention, Benjamin Franklin began by starting these little groups because he understood that organizing little groups of people, he started with merchants who were of different ages, so different generations, and they came because they were all immigrants. They came from different backgrounds. When you would start and get them to work together for a common intention, that things got better. And that's, you know, Franklin is an amazing character. When he was dying, he changed his will, and he left. He changed his will to allow a bequest, a perpetual trust to Boston and Philadelphia. And he said this money is to be used to be loaned at interest, not given away, to be loaned at interest to young married artificers, young craftsmen, most of whom were recent immigrants, to help them get the tools and the things that they need to start their work. And this is to, think about this, and this is to run for 100 years. And at the end of 100 years, I appoint a committee, not by name, but by job title, and they are to amend the bequest that I'm leaving. And then it's to run for another 100 years. And 200 years into the future, I can't see what the country will be. And so I appoint another committee, and that committee is to follow my intention, but to do what seems best in what America is like 200 years from now. Anyway, so he set this thing up. It transformed both Boston and Philadelphia because it created a middle class, because these young kids who were, didn't have any money, didn't have any training, it allowed them to get training, to get trained, and then to buy the tools to start their business. In order to qualify, you had to have 2 seniors who would stand surety for you, who would stand up for you. So it linked older and younger people together. Anyway, at the end of 100 years, his heirs, Franklin's heirs, from his daughter, sued to get at the money because it was now millions of dollars. And they sued to get at this money, claiming that no individual could create a perpetual trust. And the courts ruled against them, and they appealed, and the courts ruled against them a second time. And those decisions and Franklin's original bequest is what created philanthropy in the United States. We have the largest philanthropy. That's one of the good things. And it happened because of Benjamin Franklin, as he sat dying under his mulberry tree on Milk Street. Anyway, at the end of 200 years, there was $6.5 million in each of the trusts, and 6.5 in one and a little bit less in the other, because people were always trying to get at the money, of course. Anyway, they appointed the committee that he had set up 200 years earlier, and they decided at the first time in 1890, they established 2 institutions. And they decided that they would give the money to these 2 institutions as endowments. And as you and I are sitting here doing this podcast, there are several thousand young people, mostly young people of color and of very low income, who are getting an education financed by Benjamin Franklin 200 years ago. So when I say to you, I give you the example of Thoreau, or I give you this example of Franklin, you don't know what child in your class could turn out to be the next Abraham Lincoln. You don't know what little black boy who's cutting your grass may turn out to be one of the great physicists. You don't know that. You can't know that. What you can know is that you as an individual, when you make it easier for another person to fulfill their potential, you are changing not only yourself, but society as a whole. And if not us, then who? And if not now, then when?
Beautiful, Stephan. I believe we should leave it at that. You touched my heart with those last words. I have 6 children, 3 grown, 3 in my house right now. And I know they look up to me to be that leader. And then I also have employees that work for me. And I want to be that man that makes the change. And you have my word that I'm going to do it now. And that's what I believe every one of us who are listening to the words that Stephan had said today. And we know what's right. We know what we need to do. We need to just do it. Before we wrap up the show, Stephan, can you tell the people where they could find your work and maybe get some of your books?
You can find my books on Amazon or Ingram, Barnes & Noble. Just search on my name. There are both nonfiction and fiction books. My first novel was Awakening, which dealt with a lot of this. People like to read novels more than nonfiction books. You can go to get my scholarly papers. You can go to academia.edu or ResearchGate, And all of my, or many of, not all of them, but many of my research papers are there. You can go to my personal website, stephanaschwartz.com, and get all kinds of information and where my CDs and all that. You can go to YouTube and search on my name, and you can get hundreds of interviews like this one. You can go to my daily web publication, www.schwartzreport.net, SCHWARTZREPORT, schwartzreport.net. I publish it every day. It's free. It covers trends that are shaping the future. So thank you, Mo.
You're welcome, and thank you for your time. And it shows that you're doing your part. You spent a good over an hour and a half with us today. You're doing this with hundreds of other people out there, and I know you want to do more. I've heard you in other podcasts, so you're doing your part. I hope to do mine. You're welcome, and let's talk in the future. I wish you the best.
All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Take care, Stephan, and I'll be in touch.
Good.